Atlantis. Was it a giant continent in the middle of the Atlantic? An alien civilization? The Aztecs? The Irish? Or just a figment of Plato's imagination? These are just a few of the many explanations for Atlantis. But what's the best? Or at least, what is the coolest? I'm Matt, and I am joined here by my brother Brian and my cousin / honorary brother Drew. In addition to being their brother / cousin, I'm also a novelist.
And I'm Brian. I'm a graphic designer and illustrator.
My name's Drew. I'm the cousin, honorary brother, and I'm a physical therapist.
We work together to create books about dinosaurs, the ancient world, and mysteries. We love this stuff.
But we don't always agree.
We are... Let's start with some background. The legend of Atlantis isn't exactly a legend. It's not the sort of thing that people would swap stories about back and forth. Instead, we can trace Atlantis back to exactly one person, Plato. Writing around the year 360 BC, Plato tells the story of Atlantis in two of his works, Timaeus and Critias. In those works, he starts off with this elaborate story about how he first learned about the Atlantis legend. Apparently, the famous Athenian lawmaker Solon went to Egypt, where he heard about this from a family of secret priests, then told it to someone who told it to someone who told it to Plato, something like that. But you all know the basics of the Atlantis story. Atlantis, among other things, was a vast continent, supposedly the size of Asia Minor and Libya put together. Atlantis had advanced technology that was a marvel of the ancient world. Eventually, of course, the entire island of Atlantis was destroyed. As Plato famously says, "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea." Around the time of the Renaissance, it was commonplace for scholars of the time to use the idea of Atlantis as a sort of a vehicle for an exploration of their idea of an ideal government. And some, such as Francis Bacon, suggested that the idea of Atlantis could maybe be found in the New World? What? And then, of course, we have the more fanciful, but more fun, interpretations that first arose in the 19th century. Perhaps the most famous of these is Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This was a very fun idea that put Atlantis as a giant island right in the middle of the Atlantic and claimed to trace the extent of the Atlantean Empire well into the New World and across much of the Old World as well. In more recent times, everyone from serious archaeologists to maybe more fringe types have suggested all sorts of candidates for Atlantis. And that's what brings us here today. Now it is Drew's turn for his favorite Atlantis theory. Drew, what do you have for us?
So I'm going to take you guys a little bit farther away, all the way to the New World. So you may ask, why am I so interested in and so adamant that the Atlantean civilization is Mayan, Egyptian, Mesoamerican in general? I know it may be hard to believe, but I'm actually Mayan. I'm not blood related to the Mellemas.
You're not?
Yeah, it's crazy.
What other family
crazy.
secrets are you keeping from us?
Exactly. So yeah, I'm actually, I think, 96% Mayan. I did 23andMe. So yeah, that's why I have a personal preference towards this theory.
So basically, you really want to believe that you are Atlantean.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I do.
I understand that.
I like that because then we can claim Atlantean too.
Yeah, that's true. So my personal opinion of who the Atlanteans were is that it was one culture that actually spread out to other different cultures that we know of today, such as the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Olmecs, the Aztecs. What do they all have in common? They all built pyramids, which is one thing that French writer, historian, philosopher, and archaeologist, and also Catholic priest, Charles Etienne Brasseur de Bourbourg. So this man, he was born in 1814. He had a very interesting introduction into this whole archaeology and sociology of Mesoamerican people. Kind of came after all of the French exploration with Napoleon, and I think the Rosetta Stone was found in like the end of the 1700s, and that's when this Charles guy became infatuated with finding like the next big discovery. So Mr. Charles de Beaubourg, he actually was the first one to translate the Popol Vuh, which is like the Quiche, for lack of a better word, Bible, into French and then into the rest of the languages that we know. And what's interesting is that he found that the Popol Vuh also had a great flood in it, which is also described by Plato, as we've talked about before with the destruction of Atlantis and the flood. But this man, he also inspired who Matt's mentioned before, Ignatius L. Donnelly, who wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He believed that Plato was also telling the truth.
So I get this connection between all these folks who built big pyramids, right? The Egyptians, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Olmecs. Was there some other connection that he found, or was that sort of the core thing that pinned them together?
From my understanding, that was the main thing that really brought all of those cultures together. It was mostly that back then it was the Europeans, kind of thought that they were the greatest thing that was ever created. And so they saw all these ancient civilizations that were more modern and more advanced. And so they came to the conclusion like, oh, it must have been some type of advanced race or aliens. Which is also something that I was going to bring up, is that some of these people also believe that it was aliens that were the ones that brought this culture and the ability to build these massive temples and give this good technology to these people and let them flourish.
So, Drew, I have, just to give a little bit more credibility to this, so I have heard that when Solon was talking with the Egyptians and getting the information about Egypt, that the Egyptians actually claimed to be a part of the Atlantean Empire. That's how they got their start.
Did they?
That's what I heard.
Interesting.
So, just to give a little bit of credibility to this, the Egyptians themselves could have claimed to be a part of their culture.
So I have a clarifying question. So this theory then is that, among other folks, the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Olmecs, and the Aztecs all descended from some common people, right?
Yes.
Okay, so under that theory then, like, Mayans would be related to Egyptians.
Yes.
So I do find this genre of theory really interesting because of what it says culturally. You touched on this, Drew, that there was a time of European exploration of the world where Europeans were a little rattled when they figured out that other people had like society and civilization and technology. Like you hear a lot of this writing when Westerners first discovered Japan, right? The Europeans expect like, well, we're the ones with culture. We'll, show these poor people, what to do. And they're like, oh, Japan actually has a lot of society. They have a lot of rules. They have technology. It's a very similar thing with the New World in the great empires of the New World, like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas. Europeans come on over and they realize, oh, not only are we not the only ones with civilization, but these guys are better than us at a lot of stuff. They have these advanced calendars. They have these really impressive buildings. They have civilization. That's jarring. And it really shook a lot of the European sense of self at that time. So it's really not surprising that a lot of folks would look over and be like, you know what? Atlantis. Or, you know what? Aliens. That explains how other people could have all this cool stuff. So It's really, when you look at the attitude at the time, it's really not surprising that these theories would come out.
Yeah, and I did read some of that where just the fact that, Europeans would come out with like, oh, it was most likely aliens or some advanced civilization that gave this information and the blueprints for all the pyramids to these other people, that it was almost racist because they're essentially saying like, oh, it couldn't have been these brown people that were able to build all these magnificent structures. It had to have been either some advanced race from Mars, or like an ancient white race that I don't know, but so yeah. And here's where I start to formulate my own theory, because I'll be honest with you, viewers, this kind of stopped pretty much in its tracks somewhere around the 1800s with theories. But I know there's still some of us that believe. I myself believe that it wasn't, probably wasn't aliens. It wasn't a superior singular white civilization. I think it came from people that looked like me. And we just were able to spread that information, and and it went to just varying different cultures throughout the world. Also, I always kind of felt just very special in my abilities.
When you saw Disney's Atlantis, you
Yes.
felt like this was about you.
I did.
That's what you're saying.
And what's even funnier, I don't know if you guys watched it, but it was the Black Panther 2. Pretty much like that's the argument winner right there.
Perfect.
Like if Disney says that the Mayans are Atlanteans, then I guess it has to be true. So
I have a question for you, Drew. I am curious. Is this something you believe in, like the rational, logical part of your brain, or is it more like I believe in my heart that the blood of Atlantis flows through my veins? What are we talking about here?
yeah, it's more of a feeling for sure. If you take the DNA of a Mayan or an Aztec person and put it against the DNA of an Egyptian person, it's gonna look quite a bit different, I'm sure. But science isn't everything. That's
So I will say, Brian and Drew, a part of me wants to be the boring nerd who's like, well, what evidence do you have for this? But the other part of me is like, I mean, that theory is just too fun. I mean, come on, let's just not overthink it. Let's just run
I think
with it.
I've given an overwhelming amount of evidence.
I stand with Brian too.
If you have maybe your own favorite candidate, either one that you actually think is plausible or one that you just think is fun, please let us know in the comments. Or if any of us missed anything, if you think one of us left a good argument for our side on the table, or if we got something wrong, let us know in the comments as well. If you want to watch a similar video that we've done, one about arguing over ancient civilizations and cool giant superstructures, why not check out our video on the supposed Bosnian super pyramid?
Also, carrying over the tradition from our last video about Nessie, let's make this another competition. You guys can tell us in the comments whose theory you think is best, and maybe we can tally up the points.
And as always, don't forget to boop that like button and subscribe.